everyone. So it is 10 o'clock, so I think we'll get started with our presentation for today. So once again, welcome. Thank you all so much for coming this evening, and thank you also to everyone who's tuning in virtually today. As mentioned, my name is Mitchell Daniels, and I'm the Ability Acceptance Presenter with Grandview Children's Center. And we'll talk a bit more about what Grandview is in a little bit. Now, for today's presentation, we're really going to be focusing on the topic of what we call ability acceptance, and really this idea of being accepting of individuals of all abilities. And we're going to be talking a little bit about different common disabilities in Canada. In addition, we're also going to be discussing the importance of doing our best to try and make the club as accessible as possible for individuals of all abilities. Now, allow me to formally introduce you to Grandview Children's Center. Now, Grandview Children's Center, or Grandview Kids for short, is Durham Region's leading pediatric rehabilitation center, and we serve clients essentially all the way from the age of 0 all the way up to the age of 21. And we offer a wide variety of different services throughout the Durham region, including speech and language therapy, physiotherapy, we have a Botox clinic, we have hearing clinics, so there's a wide range of different therapies and programs that we offer. We also provide in-school programming as well, and of course, our education wing of the organization, which is the section of the organization that I'm a part of myself. Now, a little bit about me. So as I mentioned, my name is Mitchell, and I'm the Ability Acceptance Presenter with Grandview Children's Center. And I was born with hydrocephalus, also known as water on the brain, and later diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Because of this, I had no speech until the age of 3, and I was in a wide variety of different therapies and programs for about the first 10 years of my life. I'm also a former Grandview client myself, so it's been really, really great to return to Grandview in order to tell my story and help to inspire those with disabilities to always strive to be the best version of themselves possible. Now, I've been working as a disability advocate since about 2014, and outside my work doing disability advocacy work, I also work as a vocalist, specializing in Broadway jazz and opera, and I also work as an educational interpreter over at what was previously known as Black Creek Pioneer Village, and today is known as the Village of Black Creek, where I demonstrate a wide variety of different historic trades. Now, for my work, I ended up receiving the Lieutenant Governor's Volunteer Award, the Town of Ajax's Community Volunteer Award, and was also named a recipient of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee Medal. Now, before we begin talking about the idea of ability acceptance, I thought we'd start off the morning with a little bit of trivia. Now, what you're going to see in a moment is a series of multiple choice questions. And for those who are on the call, feel free to shout out the answer if you think you know the answer, and we'll see who the first person is to guess the right answer. And the winner will receive bragging rights. Now, according to a 2017 Statistics Canada study, what % of the Canadian population has one or more disabilities?
C.
C, you're very, very close.
B.
B, absolutely, 22%. Very, very good. Now, what is the most difficult age group to identify a disability within? A, absolutely. Now, does anyone know why that is?
They can't vocalize what they're feeling and thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So not only are they typically nonverbal at that age, but also they tend to develop at quite drastically different rates at that very, very young age as well. Now, what is the most common disability that is diagnosed in the 5 to 14 age group?
C.
D. C, mental and psychological. D, learning disabilities. You are absolutely correct. Very, very good. Now, many people often think...
Bragging rights.
Indeed. Now, many people often believe that it's autism that's the most common diagnosis, and indeed, that is a very, very common diagnosis, but it's not necessarily the most common, but excellent work. Now, throughout today's presentation, you're going to hear a lot about the topic of what we call ableism. Now, ableism itself can come in a wide variety of different forms, and we're going to talk exactly what ableism looks like. Who here has heard of the term ableism before? A couple people, excellent. So based on that, ableism could look like A, bullying, B, discriminatory hiring practices, C, inaccessible environments, or D, all of the above. D, absolutely. Yes, we're going to talk more about that later on in our presentation as well. And this is, of course, why ability acceptance should matter to everyone. And one of the main reasons why the idea of ability acceptance, so essentially the idea of being accepting of individuals of all abilities, is that accessibility is the law. And here in Ontario specifically, it's actually protected under several different laws and various other acts as well. Principal among these is the AODA. Now, this is typically required training for anyone entering into a new workplace. They are typically required to do AODA training, and I do highly recommend redoing the training every few years because there's always new updates in regards to how to assist individuals with disabilities. The AODA, those who may not necessarily be quite as familiar with it, is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And that outlines all of the rights for individuals with disabilities for their, essentially for their care workers and medical professionals, as well as the rights of individuals in public places and the rights of organizations in regards to essentially helping individuals with disabilities. Now, in addition, more recently, there's also another very, very important act that's also come essentially more into essentially common practice, and that is the Ontario Service Dogs Act. And that was just introduced in 2016, so it is relatively newer, but essentially it further strengthens the idea of the AODA. Now, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act has actually changed quite a bit from when it was first introduced. When it was first introduced, it focused a lot on individuals with physical disabilities. However, it now covers a much broader spectrum of various different types of disabilities as well. Now, I mentioned earlier about the topic of ableism. And ableism is discriminating against someone based on their abilities. And this can come in a wide variety of different forms. And it can be both visible and invisible. But it's also very, very important to remember, too, that it can also be a conscious and a subconscious decision as well. And it can be, as I mentioned, both intentional and unintentional. Now, one example of this has to do with the early introduction of the AODA. So when the AODA itself first came out, it also provided a brief list of different examples of how to make workplaces more accessible. Problem was, it didn't necessarily specify exactly how to implement these changes. And consequently, what you end up seeing with the buildings that essentially were following the earliest version of the AODA is a building where there's a nice ramp leading up to it, only for it to essentially to lead to a door that then opens up to a set of stairs, which sort of defeats the entire purpose of a ramp. So that's just sort of one example of an unintentional example of ableism. Now that's just one example, but can you think of any other examples of ableism that you've witnessed in your own life?
I find a lot of sidewalks, they're supposed to have like a ramp, but sometimes those ramps are, you can see people with walkers or wheelchairs having difficulty going up those ramps if there's still like a little bit of a lip or something that they can't get up and stuff.
Absolutely, right. So not only that, but also the grading of those ramps as well, right?
The upkeep. Yeah.
Exactly, the upkeep, and also sometimes, especially if there's been some shifting in the concrete or the cement, sometimes it can be quite a divide between the blocks of sidewalk, right? And so sometimes workers will do this, they'll come around and they'll file down portions of the sidewalk and try and make it smoother. However, that can sometimes also be quite dangerous for an individual with a disability or make it a lot more challenging for them, especially if someone, for example, using a wheelchair or a walker or other mobility device. It can make it a lot more challenging for them to actually navigate that particular area, depending on how it's been graded down, essentially. Can anyone think of any other examples? What about on the call here? Can anyone think of any examples?
Would it also include, say, for example, the subway, when the escalators or the elevators are out of service and there's no other option for them to get around?
Absolutely there, Mary. Yes, definitely. And that's an excellent example. We did this presentation a couple weeks ago, and we were talking, Drew and I were talking And we were talking about the subway. Now, the subway is really, really interesting because it was installed primarily in the 1950s. And this was before there was a really sort of good understanding about how to make spaces accessible. And so now, of course, in the case of the TTC, they're now trying to retrofit their stations to try and make them more accessible. But one of the problems there exactly is that there's only maybe one accessible entrance, right? And so what happens if the elevator's out of order, or what happens if the escalators are out of order? Well, now suddenly these individuals, they now need to go either essentially to the next subway up, or perhaps they need to get the assistance of a safety attendant or a station attendant. And so not necessarily the ideal situation, but yes, you're absolutely correct. So that's another example of unintentional ableism. Very, very good. Can anyone else think of any examples, either here in the meeting room or on the call?
Maybe a washroom can be another example, like maybe there's no special washroom that can actually take them, it's more accessible for them, or even easy to use for them. There's no bars.
Absolutely, yes. And also to the location of the washroom as well. Now, and this is very much the case with a lot of storefronts in the city. Oftentimes, again, a lot of these buildings were built, of course, sometimes several decades ago. And so in order to access those washrooms, you need to go down a set of stairs, which again, sort of defeats the purpose of an accessible washroom. I've seen on a number of different occasions where they'll mark it with the accessible washroom sign, again, only to lead to a set of stairs. And yes, the washroom itself might be accessible, but of course, if individuals with disability can't get down there, then of course it sort of defeats the purpose. Excellent example. Those are all amazing examples, everyone. And you can see really then why it's very, very important to try and avoid ableism as much as possible. And there's a number of different ways in which we can go about doing this. And the first way is to educate yourself. And of course, attending presentations like this is an excellent way to do that. In addition, thanks to the advent of the internet, there's lots and lots and lots of amazing lectures and conferences you can attend on the topic, and of course, educational videos online. But then there's also a number of different advocacy societies dedicated to providing complementary resources in order to increase such an individual's understanding when it comes to this idea of accessibility and this importance of avoiding ableism. In addition, make sure to talk to individuals, and this might include here in the club, getting to know the clients. But when I say that, getting to know the clients first before their disability, that will all come with time. But it's so, so, so important to get to know the individual first. And then, of course, you're going to talk about some of their similarities and some of their differences in the way that they sort of navigate their own lives as opposed to your own life. And just from conversations like that can really make all the difference when it comes to this idea of thinking about accessibility at all times and this idea of avoiding ableism. In addition, it's very, very important to speak up if you see or hear someone exhibiting ableist behaviors. Again, keeping in mind that sometimes in the case of ableism, people may not necessarily always realize when they're exhibiting examples of ableism. So just by providing them with that very, very gentle reminder, and it doesn't have to be anything too major, just, well, actually, we might maybe want to maybe go up this way because it's a little bit of an easier route. So even just something as simple as that can make all the difference to an individual with a disability. And of course, as much as possible, trying to find ways to make activities as accessible as possible, or finding an appropriate alternative that the entire group can participate in. Now let's review what essentially we've discussed so far. So of course, we've learned that many individuals in Canada have one or more disabilities, and that the most common disability in school-aged children is often invisible. And it's harder to identify disabilities in early childhood because children tend to develop quite drastically differently, especially in that early stage of development. And lastly, but certainly not least, we each have a responsibility to play to avoid ableism. Now, I absolutely love this quote, and it reads, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Now, I'd like to think about a time when you went to either a local attraction, maybe it was when you were on vacation. Who did you interact with, and was it a good interaction? Why or why not?
I went on vacation once to the Dominican Republic, and then one of our servers there, Juan, was very, very nice and respectful, and he always went out of his way to provide the best service. So we always remember that every morning that we saw him, and that made a big impact on the whole trip as well.
That's an excellent example. And of course, you remember his name as well, right? Which of course makes all the difference as well, right? Chances are, if you didn't necessarily receive good service, it would have been, of course, an entirely other experience, of course, for you, and of course, an entirely other memory as well, right, of the experience. And you mentioned, of course, that they were quite helpful, right? So again, it would have been a very, very different experience had they not been helpful. And this is very much the case when it comes to assisting individuals with disabilities. It's very, very important, of course, having been now to the club on a few different occasions now, I've seen the absolutely amazing job you all do with customer service and essentially assisting the members and clients. Really, in all that you do an absolutely amazing job. But of course, as you can imagine, it makes all the difference, especially for individuals with disabilities. So really, and we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for working with individuals with disabilities in order to help to really further that amazing customer experience as well. And one way in which we can do this is by creating essentially a sense of belonging and inclusion for all, and really creating these spaces that promote that as well. And one of the most important things to remember when we get into this is the idea that language matters, especially when we're talking about the topic of disabilities. Now, another very, very important thing to keep in mind is that many individuals have different preferences when it comes to talking about their disabilities. So some people might be very, very comfortable talking about their disabilities, and others may be very uncomfortable. So it's very, very important to take that into consideration when you're interacting both with clients and potentially even new members of staff who might have a disability. So again, it goes back to this idea where you make sure to get to know and genuinely get to know the person, either the client or the individual first, before getting to know about their disability. That will all come with time, but get to know the individual as a person first before getting to know their disability. Now, in addition, they may have different ways they might describe their disability. And essentially two of the most common ones is the idea of people first versus identity first language. So of course, an example of people first language would be a person with autism, and identity first language would be an autistic person as an example. And of course, these do come in a wide range of different forms as well. Now, one other way that we can work toward a path toward ability acceptance is working toward what we call becoming an inclusive ally. And this isn't necessarily a title that you can give yourself per se, but rather it's a series of traits and skills that you can continuously develop over time. And this might be even just something as simple as even inviting someone with a disability to even join you at lunch. Again, just a very, very small thing. Again, just getting to know the individual and networking with that individual. So again, it doesn't necessarily take very much to become an inclusive ally, and an inclusive ally can, of course, come in a wide variety of different forms. Now, how exactly do you become an inclusive ally? Well, whenever you interact with an individual with a disability, it's very, very, very important to be patient. Oftentimes, it might take a little bit longer for someone with a disability to process what has been asked of them, or perhaps even simply just to respond to a request that's been asked of them. This might even come in the form of a conversation, so it might take them longer to even answer you as well, depending on their disability. In addition, it's also very, very important to remember that when we're working with individuals with disabilities, that oftentimes a big aspect of having a disability is also that many of these individuals also struggle with anxiety as well. And so making sure that when you are interacting with them, that you stay genuinely positive as much as possible. And always try and provide positive reinforcement, but at the same time, try not to rush the individual. So make sure to be as positive as possible while also being patient at all times. Now, never assume that just because someone has a disability, that they need assistance 100% of the time. Now, a couple of years ago, I was actually in a TV program called Employable Me in an episode called Ben and Mitchell. And the individual who appeared alongside me, his name is Ben, and essentially he is an individual who is entirely visually impaired. So he can only really just see shadows. And because of this, he uses a guiding cane in order to navigate his environment around him. And he talks about how on multiple occasions, he'll be waiting at the bus stop, relatively close to the curb, and a complete stranger will come up, grab his arm, drag him across the road, and he tries to explain to him, no, I'm just waiting for the bus. But of course, by the time he's done that, because of course it takes him a little bit longer to respond because of his disability, they've already made it across the road, and he's missed his bus. So again, this just further emphasizes the importance of making sure to be patient, be positive, and never assume that just because someone has a disability that they need assistance at all times. Now, it's perfectly acceptable to ask an individual with a disability if they need assistance, and also when you do that, make sure to follow up with, how can I best assist you? Because oftentimes individuals may have developed various different adaptive ways in which they can navigate the world, so making sure to ask them how you can best assist them, rather than simply just asking whether or not they need help, because they might say, oh yes, I need you to go grab the store, but there might be a specific way in which they want you to go and grab the door for them. So just something as simple as that can make all the difference when you're interacting with these individuals with disabilities as well. In addition, make sure to think about accessibility at all times. And this can even be something as simple as even if you're in an office space, for example, and there's a chair that's sort of in the middle of the room, that can often be very, very challenging for someone with a mobility device to navigate around, or someone that might have challenges with their muscle tone to even move that chair. So even taking that into consideration in a space like that can again make all the difference for an individual with a disability. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to make spaces more accessible in a little bit as well. And of course, as we've already discussed, it's very, very important to avoid ableism as much as possible. So again, this idea of discriminating against someone based on their abilities. And last but certainly not least, to remember the phrase, nobody's perfect. Now, this was a phrase that was given to me by my grade 5 teacher, Dr. Jeffs, and this was on our blackboard literally all year long, and it became very much a motto for my life. The idea that nobody's perfect. Now, it's not a spelling mistake, but instead it's very much a way of life. The idea that nobody is perfect. So everyone has their own strengths and challenges, and it's very, very important to build on those strengths and celebrate those strengths, while also helping them to mitigate their challenges as much as possible. Now, I have a few other examples of how to become an inclusive ally. The one that I wanted to highlight in particular is to never exclude anyone from an activity simply based on their abilities. Oftentimes, many individuals with disabilities are just as capable of doing various different activities. They just might have a slightly modified way of doing things. Now, what can you do to make your workplace more accessible? Well, let's talk about lighting, for example. Now, of course, it's a very, very exciting time at the club with the development of the new build. And nowadays, of course, a lot of construction companies are a lot more familiar with a lot of the different accessible features out there as well. And so one of the things when we look at creating an accessible space, first of all, is we can look at the lighting. Now, oftentimes, individuals with disabilities can be very, very sensitive to extremely bright lights and extremely dim lights. So perhaps even this might involve essentially the option of even having a dimmer switch on each of the individual rooms where you can adjust the light levels if there is someone that requires that type of accommodation. And again, that can make all the difference. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a major change. It can even just be a slightly dimmer space or a slightly brighter space. Perhaps this might also involve even getting those little clip-on little LED lights as well, for example, if they need to read a menu, for example, in the restaurant. So again, that can make all the difference, just having that option available to them. In addition, recognizing as well that noise levels can make all the difference as well. So oftentimes, individuals can either be very, very sensitive to loud noises, or you may need to speak up a little bit and a little bit more clearly and make sure to enunciate using proper diction in order to assist those individuals. Now, if we're talking about someone who has essentially any hearing loss of any sort, it's very important that when you're talking to the individual, that you make sure to stand facing them as much as possible, face on, and make sure to enunciate as much as possible. And sometimes that might also involve slowing down how you speak And that could just help the individual with the hearing loss to better understand what's being asked of them. In addition, making sure to recognize different sensory triggers. So this can even be something as subtle as even a change in the texture of the floor. Sometimes certain individuals with disabilities have a very, very essentially difficult time with even these minor changes. It might even be the color of a particular room. And so that there's these all these little things that can often set off an individual as well. And so just really taking that into consideration. It's also important to remember too that sometimes individuals with disabilities struggle with transitions. And this can even be something as simple as even going from one side of the room to the other. And so if you're working with a client that requires a little bit of assistance navigating the club here or even out in the community, providing them with a little bit of a heads up. So for example, okay, right now we're down at the reception desk and now we're going to head over to the tennis courts where we are going to have to go outside. So we're going to have to walk down the path. So even just providing them with those sort of transitionary sentences, if you're assisting someone navigating through the club again, can make all the difference to those individuals as well. In addition, make sure to make use of assistive technology. Now, we're so fortunate in the days of smartphones and as I say, the internet, there's a plethora of various different assistive programs and applications out there now, including a number of different text-to-speech softwares and read-aloud softwares as well. In addition, if you have someone, for example, that's visually impaired, making sure to provide that opportunity, for example, if you're working in the restaurant, to offer the option to potentially read the menu to them as well. And that can also help make a world of difference for them as well, or provide large print options of menus as well, and other documents throughout the facility as well. In addition, a lot of businesses, I would highly recommend also when you're developing the new signage to also include Braille, or alternatively, a Braille guide that you can offer them at the front desk with it. Essentially, you can maybe even do as sort of a sign-in, sign-out process. So again, there's a lot of these, really, really simple actions that you can do that, again, can make all the difference for an individual with a disability. Now, when people think about implementing accessible features into their business, oftentimes they automatically assume that it's going to be extremely expensive, but that's not necessarily the case. As you've heard today, there's a number of very, very easy alterations you can make to rooms that, of course, cost very little, or in most cases, don't cost any money whatsoever to implement into the facility itself. In addition, it's also very, very important to, when we talk about working with individuals with disabilities, to provide them with that additional time. Again, going back to this idea that sometimes an individual with a disability may also struggle with transitions as well. And so by providing them with a little bit of extra time, and again, not pressuring them to go from one activity to the other immediately, can again make all the difference to that individual as well. And of course, going back to this idea of providing accessible signage. And this can also include trigger warnings. So for example, in the spa facilities here, so for example, in the massage rooms here, providing notices that there might be strong smells in those rooms with the different massage oils and what have you. That's just another example. Or for example, down at the indoor court, recognizing that again, there might be strong smells. For example, if there was fresh clay put down on the courts, or especially when the bubbles go up again, the smell of the material from the large, essentially covered domes, that can often be a real trigger for someone with a disability as well. So again, just providing those trigger warning signage. I had actually worked with the village of Black Creek on developing a number of different trigger warning signage, and we found that it made a huge difference for the visitor experience as well. Now to conclude, as we've learned, there are many different types of disabilities, and it's very important to listen to individuals with disabilities and do our best to support them in as many ways as possible. And it's also important to remember that how we say things matters, and that everyone has their own preference when it comes to language in regards to talking about someone's disability. But of course, we can all work towards becoming what we call an inclusive ally. So I'd like to thank each and every one of you so much for taking the time to listen to the presentation today. But before we wrap up, does anyone have any questions at all for me?
Mitchell, I've got a question for you. So you talked a little bit about designing spaces
Yes.
that kind of manage the needs of everybody. Is it a generally accepted practice, given that we're going into a rebuild? So you've got project managers and construction managers who work with a number of consultants. Are there consultants that work in that field that come in, like that they bring in to say, how do we make our space more accessible to everybody? And they look at what the design of the space is and offer suggestions on things that can be done.
Absolutely, yes. There are a number of different consulting firms in regards to that as well. There's also a number of different assistive technology providers and assistive signage providers out there as well. What I can do, I can definitely follow up with you on that particular one to provide you, because we're actually just in the process right now of developing a brand new state-of-the-art facility over in Ajax as well. So we're working with a number of different accessibility advisors as well, plus our own staff as well. But I can definitely provide you, if you'd like, with a list of some of our.
That'd be great. It just occurs to me as we're going through this process, and you've got to, I see the list of consultants coming in to do everything from, you've got architecture and you have interior design, but this seems to me to be an important element of all of that kind of gets integrated into all of those.
Yes.
Into those.
Absolutely. And again, it can be very, very, simple things like even something as simple as even installing a dimmer switch on rooms, right? Again, providing that option for alternative light levels, right?
Yeah.
Or, even providing, of course, a scent-free environment. Again, these are all very, very easy things to implement as well. But of course, there are the more major things, right? Again, for example, accessible washrooms. Well, how do you go about doing that, right? So, of course, a lot of businesses now are using the accessible buttons as well. So where there'll be an alarm, for example, by the toilet, and of course everything is at a wheelchair accessible level. And then also, rather than there being an actual physical door lock, it's an electric lock. And so that can make it a lot easier, particularly for someone that struggles with their fine and gross motor skills. So by having that large button as opposed to a small little bathroom door lock, again, that can make all the difference for an individual, even using that type of facility as well.
Yeah. It just occurs to me because I we've been in the doctor's office or dentist's office a lot with our kids the last little while, and I've noticed even counter heights in some spaces are lower than they traditionally were. So traditionally they're at, I think, 31 or 33 inches high, and a lot of spaces now have gone to a lower counter height to account for the fact that, from an ableism perspective, not everybody can stand over the counter, or even if you are in a chair, you can't see over the counter in a chair. So
yes. Absolutely. And I mean, just in general, regardless of whether or not an individual has a disability, definitely in the case of, certain reception counters, they're high. Especially exactly some of the older ones, they are quite high often, right? And so this idea of how can we make the space as welcoming and as accessible as possible, right? So absolutely.
I think that migrated from your own home, right? When they would do accessible kitchens.
Maybe,
so
yeah.
Kind of, lower. Nobody ever thought about, like you say, then it's the offices, right? Places like that. So
and this also goes back to the early implementation of the AODA as well, right? So again, one of the early recommendations was that you created an accessible reception desk. Well, what exactly does that mean? So in the sort of 90s and early 2000s, you would see where they would create just one, for example, one cash register that was accessible. Well, that's great, but what if there's a lineup, right? Now someone using a mobility device now only has access to that one cash register, right? So again, it's all these, all these little things, to take into consideration. So you've created this one cash register that, that's accessible. Well, why not roll that out across all of the cash registers in that particular case, right? So again, it's all these little things, to take into consideration as well when developing an accessible space, right? So, and also recognizing that it's not necessarily just individuals with mobility devices that might benefit from a lower counter, right? Even something like for example, with children, right? So, of course, here at the club, you have a number of clients and members who are children as well, right? So we've been providing that lower counter for them, right? Can also make it a lot more accessible for them as well. Yeah.
Sir Mitchell, you forgot about the star of the show.
Indeed, yes. So, yeah. So this is my service dog, Sasha. Now, Sasha is my autism service dog. Sasha, stay. Let's say it's sweet. So autism service dogs are relatively new as opposed to most other breeds or most other types of service animals. And she primarily helps with my anxiety and my self-esteem. Now, here in Ontario, as I mentioned, we have the Ontario Service Dogs Act, and there's several different types of animals that are used for working. So you have service animals, you have emotional support animals, and you have therapy animals primarily. In addition, you also have emergency response dogs, you have police dogs, among many, many others. Now, in Ontario, the only dogs technically that are permitted in any space are registered service dogs. And one of the biggest challenges in recent years is the rise in fraudulent service animals. Now, technically by law, a service animal is allowed in any space that the public has access to, or any place essentially that the public can set foot in, with the exception of a surgical room and a kitchen. However, with that, there's a few exceptions with that. There's more specifics. I'll send a copy of both the AODA and the Ontario Service Dogs Act as well, following the presentation as well. But oftentimes, individuals take a look at this and they say, well, why can't I bring my dog into a space like this, right? And so increasingly, we're starting to see a rise in fraudulent service animals, and it's extremely easy to go on a website like Amazon and purchase a fraudulent service dog vest, for example, and fraudulent ID. And so increasingly, for the accredited agencies, and I should mention and emphasize that this isn't necessarily all agencies, but increasingly more and more agencies are starting to move over to this particular form of identification. But I'll pass this around here. You can see this. This is an agency called Assistance Dogs International. This is the International Accreditation Agency. And so that tells you which agency, in this case, Sasha came from, what breed she is, her membership number, her registered Ontario Service Dog identification number, her microchip number, and who her trainer was or where her kennel was. Certain training agencies will include slightly different information, but the most important thing is to know when their last public access test was, their registered service dog number, and the agency that they came from. Now, you will still continue to see the traditional paper or plastic cards. However, typically for legitimate service dog IDs, it will include all this information regardless of the form of card. So whether it's a digital card like this or a physical card. In addition, you'll also notice how there's a QR code on the ID as well. And that links to the accredited agency's website. And then you'll also see things like Assistance Dogs International accredited member.
Are you allowed to ask for that information, Mitchell?
That's a very good question there, Keith.
I heard you weren't.
That's a very good question. So you are allowed to ask for ID, but only if the service animal is acting out. If they are doing what Sasha's doing right now, so essentially if they're just laying down like this and not being terribly disruptive, then typically there's not normally a need to necessarily ask for ID. However, if the dog is barking and sort of jumping up on people, then yes, and there is essentially that would be the time to ask for ID.
The last presentation we had, Lloyd, me, and Antic didn't even know Sasha was here.
What? And so that's sort of the main thing there. And then as essentially, particularly for the front of house staff, if the dog itself is misbehaving, you can give the client or the visitor warning. However, if it continues, at that point you can ask for them to leave the premises with the service animal, but only if they're misbehaving. If they're sitting like this, not really causing too much of a fuss, there's no reason to ask them to leave. But oftentimes you can typically tell when there's a fraudulent service animal versus a legitimate service animal, and just in the general behavior of the animal. In addition, there's also several commands as well that the handler will use with the animal. So for example, in the case of Sasha, so she knows whenever she comes up to a doorway to sit, so we use the command stop. Other agencies might use a variation on these commands, but in general, you will see things like that. So for example, when the person comes up to a doorway, the dog will sit. Sometimes there might be a command, sometimes there won't. In addition, when they're sitting at a table, most service animals are typically trained to lie at the handler's feet and stay there until they're told otherwise. In addition, even though I mentioned, yes, in general, a service dog should not bark, sometimes the barking itself can also be used as a trigger warning, particularly for seizure response. And so making sure to take that into consideration, you can definitely ask what the service dog is used for. However, don't press the client on it too much, because again, going back to also how comfortable individuals are essentially with talking about their disabilities. Again, some people are more comfortable than others, and some people feel very, very insecure when it comes to talking about their disabilities and then also their service dogs as well, because oftentimes the service animal becomes just an extension of the person, right? So that's very much, they are essentially one. So you recognize the individual and not so much the service animal. Yes, the service animal is present, but when you're talking to the individual, in most cases, normally you're not allowed to pet or really interact with the service animal. So you always address the individual, and you can ask them how you can best assist them in regards to interacting with their service animal. But in general, typically they aren't necessarily supposed to be pet, but that's typically normally how you interact with most service animals. And so I should also mention too, service animals can also come in a wide variety of different forms. The most common service animal is a dog, followed by miniature horses. But you might even see something as sort of strange as a service snake, or exactly. We have a really, really great example. Her name is Tulip, and so she comes to Grandview on a regular basis to help clients that are going in for essentially often maybe their first appointment at Grandview. So again, she's used for anxiety suppression. So they actually make very, very good.
Like a miniature horse on a plane or something, and it became like a whole thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And again, those animals, they also are required to go through quite extensive testing. In addition, I should also mention too, oftentimes with legitimate service animals, they often will have a copy of the AODA with them just to show business owners as well, because sometimes they will be questioned if it is a legitimate service animal. So that's sort of another thing too. So oftentimes with legitimate service animal vests, but it's also important to remember that each agency has their own unique design for the vest. But oftentimes, if it's the style that Sasha has, you'll notice it'll have side pockets, and there they'll often have information on the agency, as well as, of course, information on the AODA as well, if you do have any questions about the service animal themselves as well.
I don't even know if they're like the number of coffee shops I walk into that people just bring their dogs in without a vest or anything, and I'm just like, you do know there's food and coffee makes served.
Now
That's a whole other issue. Like I've even seen people at like shopping at Winners in the Hudson's Bay with their dogs, and I'm like, I don't know when that happened, but
Yeah,
it's become like a whole new vibe, like after
exactly.
COVID. Yeah.
Well, a lot of places like Michael's lets you take dogs,
Yeah,
their dog,
yeah.
which is fine. There's not really,
Canadian
Home
Tire,
Depot and that, which are
yeah.
the normal, which is nice because they advertise it, right? Especially in the summer.
Yes.
But
And again,
like you say, Mitchell, I think it's very easy to tell the difference between Sasha and Mitchell and somebody else that's trying to sneak their dog in.
yes. And that's another really, really great thing too with a lot of businesses, that they are increasingly making them more dog friendly, because then that also helps to cut down on the use of fraudulent service animals as well, right? And so you will also see that, especially downtown Toronto here. Even Drew, Keith, and I, we went for lunch the other day when we were meeting to discuss the presentations today, and we went over just to the local restaurant just around the corner, and that was also a dog-friendly restaurant as well. So they were really, really great there. So increasingly, you will also see that as well, and that's also in an attempt to try and limit the amount of fraudulent service animals. Now, I should mention that individuals who are caught by law enforcement with a fraudulent service animal can face quite hefty fines, and in some cases, up to 6 months in prison as well. Yes. Ouch. Yes. So excellent question there as well. Any other questions at all? Excellent. Thank you all once again so much for attending today's presentation, and also thank you to everyone who attended virtually as well. It's a pleasure to speak to you today about ability acceptance.